I sat at a wake recently, watching a family gather around an open casket. The mood was somber, the air heavy with incense. Then, just before the staff prepared to move the body for cremation, a relative stepped forward with a massive, colorful bundle, a senbazuru, 1,000 folded paper cranes. With a strange mix of reverence and haste, they tucked the bulky chain of paper into the coffin, filling the empty space around the deceased. To an outsider, it looked like a beautiful final tribute, a symbol of prayers following the soul to the afterlife. But watching the family's body language, I noticed something else. There wasn't a look of sentimental attachment on their faces as they let the cranes go. There was a look of palpable relief. Later, I gently asked one of them about it. The answer wasn't about tradition or spiritual meaning, it was brutally practical. They told me that the cranes had been taking up space in the hospital room for months, gathering dust and guilt in equal measure. We couldn't just throw them in the trash, the man whispered, so this was the only way out. That moment revealed a fascinating unspoken paradox in Japanese culture. We are obsessed with crystallizing our goodwill into physical objects, yet we have absolutely no system for what happens when the sentiment ends but the object remains. It made me realize that the senbazuru has quietly mutated. It is no longer just a symbol of hope. It has become a curse object, a burden of mandatory kindness that everyone feels compelled to create, yet no one knows how to destroy.
That anecdote it's just the perfect starting point for what we're going to dig into today.
Right.
Because you've perfectly crystallized our mission here. We're taking this seemingly simple act, folding 1,000 paper cranes, this profound expression of hope or grief, and we're using it as a lens.
A lens to look at these much deeper cultural and even systemic challenges in Japan.
Exactly. The paradox you saw, this obsession with turning goodwill into a physical thing, but with no plan, no mechanism for what to do with the material and emotional leftover. The burden. It reflects these much broader patterns of how we appreciate objects, the stress it puts on our organizations, and this pervasive societal pressure. Yeah. We're really going to examine how this one issue, this senbazuru paradox, mirrors these bigger patterns of obligation and systemic cost.
Okay, let's unpack that, because that distinction you just made between it being a symbol of hope and a curse object, that is so sharp. I think we should start with the personal weight of it, right? The psychological burden that it puts on the person who receives it or their family. Because that really gets to the heart of why those cranes in my story felt like they were gathering dust and guilt in equal measure.
Exactly. We're diving right into the challenge of what you could call the impossible gift.
The impossible gift. I like that.
Because in these deeply emotional contexts, like a severe illness or, a bereavement, the senbazuru is so much more than just paper. It represents the collective prayers, the effort, the hopes of all the people who made it.
I mean, the sheer time it takes.
The time, the painstaking effort. When someone dedicates themselves to folding 1,000 individual pieces of paper, they are quite literally investing their physical energy, their emotional bandwidth into that object. So to just discard it, it's immediately seen as a moral impossibility.
You can't do it.
You can't. It creates this immediate, very personal challenge for the family or the recipient. How do you honor all that effort without letting the physical object completely overwhelm your space and your conscience?
Because it's a physical crystallization of human care. You can't just toss well wishes or prayers into the recycling bin, can you?
No.
And that's why the cremation casket becomes this sort of perfect, if somber, disposal route. It guarantees the object goes somewhere respectful, a final release that essentially absolves the family of that responsibility to keep it forever.
And that burden, that need to retain it, is tied directly to these very deep-seated cultural mechanisms of duty and obligation. Specifically, we have to talk about the concept of on. On is one of the most fundamental concepts in Japanese moral philosophy. It translates, roughly, as a favor you've received, or an obligation to repay a debt of gratitude.
So when kindness is given in such a physical, ritualized way, like folding 1,000 cranes,
the obligation, the on, is literally materialized in that object.
Yeah.
The recipient feels compelled to preserve it because throwing it away would be seen as slighting the on they received from the givers. It turns keeping these paper cranes into an inescapable moral duty.
So that just massively increases the object's moral weight. It's not about the paper anymore. It's carrying the entire moral ledger of that relationship. And just to be clear here, we're not just talking about simple gratitude, are we? This feels like a much deeper, almost existential debt structure.
There's a crucial distinction to make. We often contrast on with a related concept, giri.
Okay.
Now, giri is more of a reciprocal social obligation. It's often tied to your role in society, your duty to your company or your community.
Mm-hmm.
But on On is a debt of favor you've received, often from someone superior, like a parent, and in theory, it is limitless, it's unpayable.
Like the kindness of parents for giving you life, that's the heaviest on of all.
Exactly. And the Sembazuru falls into this category. It's a benevolent on, created by the giver's effort, and the recipient has to carry it. To refuse to protect the physical manifestation of that on implies this massive disrespect to the giver.
So if the weight of a paper object can create this much pressure, you can only imagine how the pressure of family on can become just truly crushing. And we see this pressure showing up in some extremely tragic personal accounts.
We do.
There's
There's the profoundest stretch you can see in the case of a suicidal 14-year-old girl who drowned herself.
Oh, wow.
Her suicide note, it lamented that she could not repay the on from her parents and her older brother and sister. She specifically wrote that she felt she was the scum of society and an ungrateful coward for failing to live up to her family's hopes and for, the miserable efforts her mother made for her.
That's devastating.
It is. And it shows exactly how these objects or these acts of kindness, when they get tied to this concept of obligation, they elevate themselves into duties that feel completely inescapable. The internalized failure to repay the on is explicitly cited as a reason for self-destruction. The debt becomes a reason to eliminate yourself.
It just transforms the fundamental sentiment, doesn't it? A gift of hope, a gift of life, becomes the source of crushing, irredeemable guilt. It shifts the focus away from love or gratitude to this intense, pervasive sense of debt that you have to manage, sometimes at the cost of your own life.
Right.
And it shows the devastating consequences of placing so much moral weight on external validation and the obligation to repay.
And that connects the personal object paradox, the Sembazuru, to the broader psychological framework of the whole society.
Yeah.
The pressure of this crystallized goodwill is really just a localized, visible manifestation of a much larger systemic cultural emphasis on duty and obligation, on emness, that pervades all social relationships and expectations.
So to really understand why the Sembazuru is so hard to let go of, we need to go deeper into why the Japanese relationship with objects makes discarding them so difficult in the first place. This takes us way back, doesn't it? Centuries before modern consumerism.
That's a necessary step, yes. We have to look at the folklore, the traditional appreciation for material culture. In traditional Japanese stories, especially the ones dealing with animism, there's this idea that old, well-used objects could develop a spirit.
A kami or a tsukumogami.
A tsukumogami, exactly.
Yeah.
And this concept is crucial. Objects weren't venerated because they were new or pristine. They were venerated because of their purpose, their history, and how they improved the lives of their users over a long, long period of time. They gained value through utility and time, not just what they cost initially.
So they were valued for their service, their utility, their history, their endurance. It sounds like they almost developed a personality based on their function.
Precisely. And this belief structure meant that disposal wasn't just a physical act, it was a spiritual one. There's this powerful folktale that really illustrates the spiritual danger of disrespecting material history.
Okay, what's the story?
A little boy grew sick, and his parents couldn't figure out why. His invisible divine friends, a small tray and a pestle, told him the reason. The boy's father had thrown away his grandfather's beautiful axe, and the axe was rusting under the floorboards, actively punishing the father by making his innocent son ill.
Wait, the discarded object was actively taking revenge on the family by hurting the most innocent member? That raises the spiritual stakes of waste, exponentially.
The spiritual consequence is immense. The boy was only cured after his father retrieved the axe, polished it, and made a new handle for it, which restored its usefulness and its dignity. After that, the axe appeared to the boy as a handsome man and taught him carpentry.
Wow.
So the lesson is twofold. One, ancestral objects should never be thrown away. And two, their value is in their utility, which has to be preserved and restored.
That is extreme accountability enforced by a spiritual sanction. If you disrespect the tool itself exacts punishment. And this ancient reverence, it leads directly into the modern philosophy that kind of formalizes this aversion to waste, motanai.
Motanai, yes. Written in kanji, the core term motai is a deep Buddhist concept. It refers to the proper state of a thing, its inherent value, its true essence. So motanai literally translates to be without its rightful value. It's a regret over waste, not just material waste, but a waste of potential or essence.
And this is the concept that gained global traction, wasn't it? I remember it was championed by the Nobel Peace Prize laureate Wangari Maathai, who broadened its scope for environmentalism.
She was absolutely instrumental in connecting motai to global sustainability. She packaged it as a concept that includes the three typical R's: reduce, reuse, recycle, but crucially adds a fourth R: Respect.
Respect.
This respect demands that we use things fully and appreciate their intrinsic value before we even think about disposal. And you see this reverence for material history reflected aesthetically too in concepts like wabi-sabi, which promotes accepting battered but still usable objects as a way to extend their life and respect their history.
The ideal is profoundly beautiful. I mean, a conscious, integrated philosophy of living lightly and respectfully. But here's the crucial question for our deep dive. Where does that ideal clash with modern Japanese reality? Because we see a massive material waste problem coexisting with this philosophy.
The clash is stark, and it leads us right back to the Senbuzuru paradox. Ancient material culture, out of necessity, leaned toward what you could call extreme minimalism. It was a utility-based view of objects.
Right.
But contemporary society fosters an accumulation culture. We mistake sentimentality for active appreciation. When we keep objects out of guilt or some vague sentiment like keeping the cranes or holding on to clothes we don't wear, we are actually violating the true spirit of motanai.
Which demands that the item be used for its proper value.
Exactly.
So we keep things out of guilt, which is fueled by that on culture we talked about. But in doing so, we fail to appreciate them in the way that Tsukumogami or Motai philosophy intended through active use. The sentiment becomes a justification for hoarding, not respectful usage.
Precisely. And we see major breakdowns of this spirit today, particularly in consumption and waste. The most shocking example, I think, is food loss.
Right. Despite the cultural emphasis on eating everything, using every last bit of an ingredient.
Yes, using things like soy pulp, okara, or fish frames. Despite all that, Japan still struggles immensely with waste.
Let's quantify that gap. I mean, give us the hard numbers on the food loss.
The scale is staggering. The government estimates that total food waste in fiscal year 2021 was 5.23 million tons.
5.23 million tons.
To give you some context for that number, that annual food loss exceeds the amount of food assistance the UN World Food Program delivered globally in 2021 by about 1.2 times.
That is an unbelievable statistic.
It is. And what's perhaps most telling about the cultural shift is that nearly half of that waste, 2.44 million tons, comes directly from households. This suggests that the philosophical aversion to waste is being overridden by modern convenience, by surplus, and a lack of effective systems at home.
That is just an astonishing moral gap between the cultural philosophy and the measurable reality of consumption. Where else does this conflict show up in terms of material burden?
You see it very clearly in packaging. Japan's famous gift culture and these incredibly stringent hygiene standards lead to excessive multi-layer packaging. Individually wrapped items, even for single pieces of fruit or small cookies.
Right.
This pristine presentation is considered a mark of respect and quality, but it clashes directly and severely with any waste reduction goals. It adds this immense plastic and paper burden that's, technically necessary for the social ritual, but practically wasteful.
And what about everyday items? I'm thinking of disposable utensils that seem so common.
The issue of disposable chopsticks, waribashi, it just persists. Despite decades of promoting my hashi, personal chopsticks, as an eco-conscious gesture, single-use chopsticks are still everywhere. Convenience. And perceived hygiene standards, especially with takeout and convenience store meals. The effort it takes to carry and clean your own personal chopsticks is consistently outweighed by the ease of the disposable item. It demonstrates that when effort clashes with ease, the material burden often wins.
So the reverence for the idea of an object or the idea of respecting materials is high, but the logistical reality of managing that material object or the waste it creates is often overwhelming. And that takes us from the personal burden and these cultural roots to the institutional level. The physical manifestation of this keep everything mandate is leading to a full-blown crisis in major institutions that are legally bound by the same compulsion.
This is where the sheer volume of goodwill, crystallized into physical items, transitions from a personal dilemma into a systemic crisis. It's the Senbuzuru paradox scaled up to institutional overload. The core problem is that museums nationwide, the ultimate institutional keepers of history, are struggling with a chronic, severe shortage of storage space.
And the reason for this chronic shortage, just like the cranes, is because the items keep flowing in, driven by public goodwill, but they never, ever go out.
Precisely. Local residents are continuously donating artifacts. This is often driven by necessity, as elderly people downsize or pass away, leaving no one to pass on culturally significant or just plain old belongings to. So the artifacts are coming in faster than museums can process or catalog them, and the museums lack the financial or physical resources to expand their storage to match.
But why is the system designed only for inflow? Is there a formal, like a legal mandate that's driving this inability to get rid of things?
Yes, the foundational legal structure reinforces this retention. The museum law itself formalizes this appreciation. It stipulates that the main roles of museums are to collect, store, and exhibit items.
Okay.
Crucially, the practical interpretation of this law dictates that museums generally accept as many donated items as they can, and in principle, do not dispose of materials once they are officially accepted. It is, by institutional design, a keep everything mandate.
Regardless of long-term utility or financial feasibility.
Exactly.
That sounds like a legal recipe for guaranteed disaster if the intake rate is way higher than the maintenance budget.
Yeah.
It's creating a systemic time bomb.
And it's already disastrous. The statistical evidence shows the severity. A 2019 survey found that 57.2% of responding museums reported their storage was almost full, or that they had items that couldn't be stored properly.
More than half.
And that was a 10% increase over the previous 6 years, which shows it's an accelerating crisis. Over half of the nation's cultural repositories are operating at or past their capacity limits.
What does that crisis actually look like on the ground? What are the tangible consequences when a museum is that full?
The situation at the Akita Prefectural Museum is a really potent example.
Yeah.
Since it opened in 1975, its collection has ballooned about sevenfold. It jumped from 28,000 items to 190,000 items. And around 70% of those items came from resident donations. Everything from Namahaj masks, which are deeply important local cultural artifacts, to old farm equipment, tools, taxidermied animals. All these things are filling the shelves and pushing storage far past sustainability.
So the very act of preserving history, which is driven by public goodwill and that sense of motanai preservation, is now actively undermining preservation efforts because of this structural overload. How does the failure to manage the burden actually damage the artifacts?
The consequences are severe. Professional museum standards dictate that artifacts should be kept in rooms with strictly controlled conditions. Temperatures around 20 degrees Celsius, humidity precisely between 60 and 65% to prevent mold, pests, degradation.
Right.
When capacity is exceeded, museums have to resort to storing collections in inadequate conditions. This often means using facilities like closed school buildings.
The ultimate example of accommodationism. Just use whatever temporary structure is available.
Exactly. But these repurposed schools, they crucially lack the necessary controls for temperature, humidity, and light. So valuable artifacts are often just stored in generic cardboard boxes, stacked high, where they're vulnerable to pests, moisture, warping. This compromises their preservation for future generations. It's ironically jeopardizing the very historical records the museum law mandates they protect.
So the well-meaning donation of an object, the object of goodwill, is contributing to the systemic failure to protect culturally significant items. It's the institutional equivalent of the cranes gathering dust and gilt, except this dust and gilt might be destroying 19th century farming tools.
And the staff know it. The Hiratsuka City Museum staff noted that they keep accepting items, even if they can't confirm their rarity immediately, because they recognize that the value of an object might only be figured out years later. They found a small piece of metal that, 7 years after donation, was identified as a rare Kamakura period harness piece.
So they can't risk throwing anything away.
They can't. They recognize the fate of a museum is to see its collection increase. But without the corresponding budget and structural resources, that cultural mandate becomes a threat to the collections themselves. The mandate to keep is prioritized over the ability to keep well.
And when the burden of material objects reaches a scale this immense, the only solution, whether it's personal or institutional, seems to be formalizing disposal. And we see this necessity being handled with extreme care in the city that receives the largest continuous volume of physicalized goodwill, Hiroshima, and its policy for managing the senbazuru.
Hiroshima receives thousands upon thousands of paper cranes every single year, donated by visitors and schools from all over the world as symbols of peace. This sheer volume created a completely untenable storage and maintenance problem, so the city had to develop a very specific policy. The goal was to transform and honor the spirit of the cranes, ensuring economical sustainability, while absolutely avoiding any appearance of disrespect toward the powerful sentiment behind them.
That sounds like a profound cultural, diplomatic, and logistical tightrope walk. How do you destroy the physical object, the paper, without destroying the intent, the peace wish behind it?
The policy outlines several crucial measures. The first, and maybe the most significant, is establishing a ceremonial burning.
The burning.
Yes, but it's conducted as a significant event, accompanied by prayer for world peace. This procedure allows for large-scale disposal while explicitly respecting the sentiment. The policy is very clear that the burning has to be done with careful consideration for the feelings of atomic bomb survivors and the children who contributed the cranes. The fire transforms the paper into smoke, which is seen as carrying the peace wish skyward.
So they're turning a necessary disposal action into a powerful, ritualized event that actually promotes the original message. They're using ritual fire as a means of acceptable spiritual release. What about repurposing the material that isn't burned?
That's the second measure, recycling and repurposing. The remaining cranes are transformed into recycled products, things like specialized paper or small goods, which can be used for thank you letters or sold. This generates some revenue and expands their peace promotion activities. And on top of that, these recycling projects are used as hands-on education for school excursions, linking the physical cranes directly to the anti-war experience.
And in a modern move, they're ensuring the non-material sentiment is preserved even when the paper is gone.
Precisely. They use digital preservation. They maintain a contributor database that records the donations, often with photos or videos, alongside the donor names. This ensures that the official record of the peace wish persists long after the material object is physically gone. It preserves the on and the sentiment digitally.
It sounds like Hiroshima has essentially solved the paradox by finding a culturally acceptable, formalized system for disposal. But even within this system, it seems like the moral weight of the crane still persists. It still demands caution and resources.
Absolutely. The policy contains a fascinating stipulation about the recycled products. For any goods or donations that are derived from the cranes, the eligibility of the receiving agency has to be strictly considered to make sure they're reputable and aligned with the peace mission.
Okay.
And moreover, fees may be charged to the recipients of these recycled products. This isn't purely for revenue, it's mandated to ensure the cranes are not treated disrespectfully. The financial transaction formalizes the respectful handling of the item, which shows that the moral gravity of the original gift demands active management, even in its transformed, recycled state. The guilt of disrespect lingers and has to be actively managed by policy and by financial control.
And that realization that the moral burden persists no matter what, that leads us to the final, broader point. The Sembazuru, this thing that requires mandatory, effort-driven activity without any exit plan, becomes a perfect metaphor for the deeper, systemic burdens created by Japan's unique social character. Its ritualized effort as a driver of systemic inefficiency.
That is the critical connection we need to make here. The pressure to fold the cranes, the pressure to store the artifacts, and the pressure to excel in life. They are all manifestations of the same systemic forces. And these forces, while they have enabled incredible economic success, also perpetuate these unexamined burdens, both psychological and material, that often end up breaking the individual.
Let's break down those core cultural drivers that perpetuate this inflexibility. We can start with the philosophical foundation that seems to favor obedience over efficiency.
The philosophical foundation is really characterized by monism and non-rationalism. This involves a strong emphasis on emotional faith and loyalty, sometimes called Nihonkyō over abstract, critical reasoning. This cultural mindset supports extremely high conformity.
The expectation is that you accept what society demands. You accept the rituals like mandatory labor or mandatory kindness or unquestioning storage without a rigorous critical analysis of the long-term cost.
Exactly. If the system demands it, you do it. You trust in the system's inherent rightness.
And this adherence is reinforced by the importance of the collective over the individual.
Which is groupism. The supreme goal is defined as the survival and maximum well-being of the tribe. This structure inherently necessitates the sacrifice of individual goals and the internalization of stress. Individuality is actively suppressed because social integration is just so strong. This is why you see the potential for an individual to sacrifice themselves entirely for the group goal, which is the very definition of altruistic suicide.
And then there's the challenge of systemic change, the way time and reform are handled.
That's accommodationism. The tendency is to focus on immediate social adjustment, prioritizing a short-time perspective. Now, this enables rapid adaptation to crises or immediate market needs, but it makes long-term systemic problem-solving and necessary reform of outdated systems extremely difficult.
Why invest billions in new, purpose-built museum storage when you can just temporarily use a closed school building?
Precisely. The short-term accommodation delays the painful, costly systemic change that's needed. This contributes directly to the accumulating material burden we've been talking about.
And these drivers clearly feed into the intense pressure for achievement that defines modern society, especially for young people. The ritualized effort becomes directly tied to this national obsession with success, shusashugi.
Shosashugi, the success principle, it's more than just ambition. It's an obsession. It's driven intensely by the authoritarian social structure and this deep-seated fear of the misery that comes with failure. This anxiety is rooted in historical necessities, dating back to pre-modern times when the government maintained an inescapable absolutism. Historically, there was no concept that society had a responsibility to care for the unfortunate or the failures. Status was everything.
So success isn't just a preference for comfort. It's a necessary precondition for basic existential security in a status-driven society with underdeveloped public welfare systems that might not be there to catch you if you fall.
Absolutely. Failure is perceived not just as a personal lack, but as a moral failing that leads to social exile. The most visible symptom of this pressure is the examination hell.
Right.
Students, especially junior high students, are shown to study significantly more mandatory hours than college students. They average 42.7 hours a week, and most also attend juku, or cram schools. And this entire rigorous preparation is evaluated by the single event of the entrance examination. Failure in this system is not a temporary setback. It is an existential threat, leaving those who fail tortured by shame and guilt. The ritualized effort is mandatory, it's unrelenting, and its failure is psychologically crushing.
That amount of mandatory self-restraint, the effort, the long hours, the constant societal pressure, it must generate massive amounts of aggression and frustration. But given the emphasis on group harmony, that aggression can't be directed outward.
And that leads directly to the cost of internalized aggression. Since aggression is traditionally stifled for the sake of harmony, it is very frequently turned inward. This contributes directly to a high susceptibility to despair and chronic stress. And we see this manifested tragically in patterns of suicide motivation.
How does the motivation for suicide differ between Japanese youth and, say, age-comparable individuals in Western cultures?
The distinction is stark, and it reveals the psychological toll of this internalized pressure. Studies comparing Japanese youth under 40 show their suicides are primarily motivated by the wish to die. A profound sense of despair that's 41% followed by the wish to be killed, which is rooted in guilt.
Okay.
In contrast, age-comparable Caucasians show a stronger wish to kill or externally directed aggression as the dominant motive at 31%. This just highlights the internalization of stress, self-blame, and despair as the core psychological outcome in the Japanese context.
And this brings us full circle, back to that concept of altruistic suicide, sacrificing oneself for the group, which, if it's committed for a group goal or as an apology, is sometimes framed within the society as an honorable or even necessary act of loyalty.
It's the ultimate expression of loyalty, the final repayment of on. And we see this not just in historical contexts, but chillingly in modern corporate life. Sacrificial suicides often involve an employee eliminating themselves as a key witness in a corporate bribery or smuggling scandal, thereby protecting their superiors and the company's reputation.
Ensuring the scandal doesn't deepen.
Exactly. They die to ensure, as one suicide note stated, that the life of our company is eternal. They're treating the corporation as the ultimate tribe that deserves the individual's sacrifice.
And the notes left behind in these cases often deliberately avoid blaming superiors, reflecting that cultural norm of preventing further shame on their families.
That's right. An employee involved in one smuggling and bribery scandal, a Mr. Yamaguchi, explicitly blamed himself for causing trouble to his company. Another employee in the same company, Mr. Yasuda, did express resentment toward his director. But even then, he still made sure his family was taken care of by addressing the note to a powerful politician. It suggests that the family's protection still relies on avoiding direct confrontation and maintaining group harmony. The life of the individual is secondary to the reputation of the collective.
And this is the underlying mechanism we've been tracing this whole time, whether it's the personal pressure or the institutional crisis, whether we look at the individual forced to keep the paper cranes to avoid dishonoring the gift,
Or the museum legally mandated to store mountains of artifacts it cannot properly maintain.
or the employee who feels they must take their own life to fulfill a corporate obligation. In every case, the mandate for ritualized effort and emotional face overrides pragmatic, systemic solutions for burdens and waste.
That is the ultimate paradox revealed by the Sembazuro. The act of creating the paper cranes, this beautiful ritualized act of hope, it mirrors the immense ritualized effort that's required for success and social adherence across Japan. And the failure to manage the resultant physical waste, the overflowing museums, the food loss, the complex Hiroshima disposal protocol, and the internal psychological waste, the despair, the internalized aggression, the tragic suicides, it all demonstrates the systemic cost. The very cultural traits that enable Japan's phenomenal economic success and stability, traits like high conformity, loyalty, and relentless effort, are fundamentally and inescapably intertwined with the unexamined burdens that ultimately break the systems and the individual.